service feeding kids during the 2020-2021 school year. We know that many of you have questions, and we appreciate you taking the time to join us today, where we hope that we're able to provide you with information to answer as many of those questions as possible. I'm joined by my team of colleagues today, and we're going to walk you through some information. Then I'm going to start by providing some housekeeping, and I suppose I should probably also start by introducing myself. My name is Kelly McDonough, and I am a Senior Program Manager on our Center for Best Practices team at No Kid Hungry, and I'll allow my colleagues to introduce themselves when they speak during their sections later in the webinar. So for our agenda today, as I said, we're going to review some housekeeping items. I'm going to share with you our back to school meal service toolkit. We're then going to move into financial recovery, nationwide waivers, CEP, other resources, and Q&A. So for some housekeeping items to begin with, if at any point during today's webinar you encounter any technical difficulties, please use the chat box to get some help. Our teammate Chelsea is behind the scenes making sure all of this runs smoothly, so thank you to Chelsea. A recording of this webinar will be shared with all registrants, so do know that you will get it. And if you have any questions for us today, please enter those into the Q&A box, and we'll get to those towards the end of the webinar after our presentations. I do want to say a big thank you to those of you that shared questions and topics of interest when you completed your registration for this webinar. It's very helpful for our team, both as we take on today's content, but also as we continue planning for the next webinars that we hope to offer you, as well as we continue to create more resources. I do want to just set the foundation for today and recognizing that there are far more questions than we will be able to answer today, but we're going to do our best to cover as much ground as possible. And like I said, there will be more webinars coming. Included here today, we're going to share with you a number of resources that are already available, as well as to share contact information if you would like to reach out to our team. So one of the things that I wanted to share to begin with, if you have not already seen, is we recently released a back to school meal service toolkit. This was designed to help you plan for meal service for the 2020-2021 school year as we continue to navigate the coronavirus pandemic. It includes detailed information about current waivers, financial recovery, recommended meal service models. It's embedded with a number of other resources and includes a hyperlink table of contacts to make it very easy for you to navigate. The webinar that we are offering this morning perhaps, if you're joining us for the West Coast, is modeled after the content in that toolkit. And I've included the link to that here, as well as the link to more of our back to school resources, which we are now housing on a handy coronavirus back to school recovery section of our website to make things very easy for you. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to my colleague Carolyn, who's going to start today by walking us through some of the program options for the new school year and hopefully help us understand those waivers a little bit better.
Thank you, Kelly. As she said, my name is Carolyn Waite-Vega, and my focus in the past has been after school meals, but based on my state agency background and love for regulations, I have become our waivers person. That said, I will say that although I've had 10 years to become an expert on CACFP and after school meals, I have only had a few months along with the rest of you to learn all of these waivers and all of these options in this new world. So I'm going to do my best, but I do not have all the answers. And for that, I'm very sorry, because I know we could all use some answers right now. But I think if nothing else, this will help you to understand the questions a little bit better. And at least you'll know where to ask your state agency for more information. So going on to the next slide, I am just going to run through the options that are available right now. We are pushing for more options. We know these are not easy, but it's what we have now, and we know the new school year is upon us. So we think it's important to understand the options that are available right now so that we can all do our best for planning, because things are not certain moving forward. As I'm sure you know, negotiations on the Hill for a new relief package in Congress have kind of stalled out. So it's really unclear when we might get more relief from Congress, and it is unclear what USDA's timeline might be for additional waivers, if any. So again, we're going to do our best in understanding what's possible with the waivers that are available now. So if we go to the next slide, we'll see a first list of nationwide waivers available through the coming school year. So for the National School Lunch Program, School Breakfast Program, and CACFP, we do have the Congregate Meal Service Waiver, the Meal Service Time Waiver, the Parent or Guardian Meal Pickup Waiver, and the Meal Pattern Waiver. And then for NSLP, we have the Offer versus Serve waiver for high school, since ordinarily Offer versus Serve is required to be implemented in high schools, but this gives you the option to not do Offer versus Serve to allow for pre-plated meals or bagged meals, grab and go, etc. So these do open up quite a few options, and we'll talk more about what those could look like. But again, just the high level, these are the waivers that are available through the coming school year. Also, if we go to the next slide, USDA did recently announce some monitoring waivers to be available through the coming school year. So for school nutrition departments, sponsoring organizations, and state agencies, these are now available to allow for desk audits rather than on-site monitoring through the coming year. For CACFP and SFSP, these actually go through next summer to September 2021, but for school programs, that's through June of 2021. And on the next slide, we have the waivers that are not available, which includes waivers for SFSP broadly. So those were not extended along with the other waiver extensions through the coming school year. So we do not have the Congregate Meal Service Waiver, the Meal Service Time Waiver, the Parent Guardian Meal Pickup Waiver, the Meal Pattern Waiver, or the Area Eligibility Waiver. So at the moment, these all expire at the end of this month. So that is the situation. For the Seamless Summer option, because it's part of NSLP, that was covered by the waiver extensions for NSLP. So that could continue to be an option, but for SFSP, none of the waivers have been extended. We also did not have the enrichment activity waiver for after school meals and snacks. So at the moment, it being summer, it's kind of a moot issue at the moment, because the option to offer after school meals through CACFP and NSLP does not exist over the summer. And USDA did not allow an option for that over the summer. But as we go into the new school year, we know that is going to be an issue where once the school year starts, you lose the option for summer meals, you switch over to CACFP at risk or NSLP snacks, but an in-person, or not necessarily in-person, but a structured and supervised enrichment activity is still required. And then the Fresh Fruit and Vegetable Program waivers have not been extended. Those were only ever state requested waivers. They weren't nationwide waivers, similar to area eligibility. But to our knowledge, none of those have been extended either. So I want to move on to the next slide. An important note I want to make is that in the waiver extensions for the coming school year, USDA made the distinction that SFSP and SSO are available for unanticipated closures only, and that planned distance learning and planned building closures do not count as unanticipated school closures. So it marks a big difference from this past school year when schools did close unexpectedly in March, that those were considered unanticipated, even if schools continued virtual learning. They were still allowed to operate as unanticipated school closures. But as of this time, USDA has said that for the coming school year, if you are planning to not open your building, then it does not count as an unanticipated school closure. Even when there are truly unanticipated closures in the coming year, though, unfortunately, none of the waivers have been extended for SFSP, which means you would still have to do congregate meal service and all of the other things that would make operating SFSP difficult during a pandemic. So it really creates quite a bind. Again, with the waiver options for NSLP extending to the seamless summer option, that could be a better option for unanticipated closures. But again, under current guidance, they have to be truly unanticipated as of this time. So moving on to the next slide, we're gonna just highlight this potential gap in service. We know a lot of schools are facing so much uncertainty and pushing back the start of the school year as a result. And we know that some schools don't start until after Labor Day, even in normal times. But with the SFSP waivers expiring on August 31st, or at least many of them expiring August 31st, it could create a gap in service until schools start in September. The school meals programs are only available on school days. So if school does not start until sometime in September, those programs aren't an option. But again, without the congregate waiver and other waivers for SFSP, that's not a feasible option. The seamless summer option may be possible in the interim until school start because of the waiver extensions for NSLP. But again, that would only be available to school nutrition department operators and not to nonprofits. So that's definitely a challenge there. If this applies to your state and your area that schools aren't going to be starting until September, I definitely recommend reaching out to your state agency. If you're a nonprofit, potentially coordinating with your school system to figure out how to fill this gap. But thinking a little bit more about what options are available during the school year, moving on to the next slide. So we have a nice graphic to try to lay out what the options are as we see them now. So we know schools have announced various possible schedules, all the way from 100% distance learning, everyone's remote, on the other side, 100% in-class learning, and then things in between, whether that's just certain grades return to school in person, just certain students identified as needing to return to the classroom, whether those are English language learners or students with IEPs, other things like that, or alternating schedules where groups of students rotate between in-class and remote learning. So again, these are the broad models that we've seen talked about. We know a lot of schools are talking about just starting remote, at least to begin the school year. Maybe they'll contemplate another model later on. So these things can certainly shift as we go. But I think to talk about possible meal service models, it's important to consider what these possible school schedule models are to know when you might be using one service model versus another. So on the next slide, we have what we think are the service model options that would go along with these various school schedule models. So if you have 100% distance learning, or if you have a hybrid model for your remote learners, you might use models similar to what you did in the spring with direct home delivery, delivery via mobile or bus routes, walk-up distribution, or drive-through distribution. If you are doing a hybrid learning model and you have students in school some days, then it opens up the option to give students meals to take home with them for their distance learning days. Not really feasible if kids are never coming to school, but it at least is an option out there for those alternating schedule options. And then for the students who are in school, while it's possible, I suppose, to operate a normal school meal service, we know that a lot of measures are probably going to be put into place to encourage safety and distancing. So that opens up questions of how to do all of this feasibly and safely. We've heard a lot of people thinking that they may still use their cafeteria service line just to be able to take advantage of that infrastructure that exists. But we've also heard people thinking about serving in kiosks in common areas, delivering directly to the classroom, or doing some kind of hybrid, like delivering to the classroom for young students who might not be able to carry back a tray of food to their room, but having cafeteria service for older students. And then for eating location, we've heard socially distanced cafeterias with every other seat or dividers between seats. I've heard of spreading kids out into common areas if the cafeteria doesn't have adequate capacity. Eating in classrooms, of course, would be an option if the cafeteria doesn't have adequate capacity. And for those of you lucky enough to be in parts of the country with decent weather through the winter, the option of eating outside. So those are some general options. And then the next slide, we kind of go into your program options and waiver considerations for each of those models. So overall, because of the guidance we have so far from USDA and the waivers, these options are generally only available through the school breakfast program and the National School Lunch Program. In both cases, whether for remote learning or in class learning. And all the usual counting and claiming and meal charging would be required in order to do these. In general, we think it is possible to do things like home delivery or mobile delivery or drive-through distribution and things like that through NSLP and school breakfast, but we do realize that it comes with a lot of extra logistical considerations. And we don't have time in this webinar to get into how you might achieve all of those things. We hope to cover those in future webinars. We just want to point out at the moment that those are considerations as you plan for the coming school year. And a big consideration related to that is, unlike in summer meals where it's available to all kids 18 and under, school lunch and school breakfast are only available to kids who are enrolled in the school system. So even with community eligibility, which Emily will talk about later, it's still limited to the kids in those schools that are determined to be participating via community eligibility. So there may need to be a plan worked out with your state agency for how you're going to track that these are in fact students enrolled in your school or in your district, and that they are being charged appropriately for their meals. And obviously that's all a bit easier in school where you're used to serving kids and used to doing some of that counting and claiming. Although again, serving in the classroom may present some added challenges if that's not something you're used to doing, and especially if you don't have the community eligibility provision or provision 2 or some other option for doing universal free meals within the school. And then, as always, just a reminder to check in with all of your state and local health and safety guidelines, especially if you are looking at serving in the cafeteria and whatnot, to figure out what your maximum group sizes are. So I know this is a crazy graphic here, but we do have this available in a resource so you can study it more and read through it a little more carefully. But moving on for now, I did just want to talk about some caveats on instructional time and attendance. So as I think was mentioned in the previous graphic, school lunch and school breakfast are only available on or for school days. So virtual learning days do count as school days. But again, you can't serve on weekends through the school meals programs or teacher professional development days or anything like that. And so related, for schools that are planning to do a 4-day school week and use a 5th day for cleaning, teacher work day, teacher professional development, etc., then NSLP and the school breakfast program are not options for the 5th day. You need some kind of instruction in order to be able to claim through school lunch and school breakfast. However, I cannot answer for you what counts as instruction in your state, what counts as a school day. I think this is a really unprecedented year. States may be changing their guidelines about what counts as instructional time, what counts as an instructional day. So this is where checking in with your state education agency is really, really critical to figure out if whatever you're doing on any given day counts as a school day. Because that's what would allow you to serve through school lunch and school breakfast. If it is truly a 4-day week and you have a 5th day without any instruction, or if you want to be able to serve meals on weekends, you can operate through CACFP at risk after school. But again, there's still that enrichment activity requirement that you would have to figure out meeting one way or another. And then again, this is just a question that we don't know how to answer, but we want to highlight how attendance is factored in, especially for remote learning, is really unclear. In general, for regular school days, you're expected to only claim meals for kids who are there in attendance. It's not clear to us exactly how this would work if you're distributing meals once a week for remote learning, whether kids are attending virtual school or not. So again, a question to talk with your state agency about. Your state agency may need to check in with the state education agency for how attendance is being determined through the coming school year. So yeah, again, sorry, more questions than answers on a lot of these things. But to move on to the options for nonprofit sponsors, we got a lot of questions about this in the webinar registration, so we wanted to make sure we touched on this. Unfortunately, the options are not great, but we just want to lay out what they are as of this moment. So for any nonprofit sponsors that are taking on the role of providing childcare for children of essential workers, and actually providing in-person care and in-person services, you may have some more options than others. And so those are laid out on the next slide. So no SFSP option. Again, none of the waivers have been extended. However, you could try to work with schools and be able to serve through school lunch and school breakfast. I'm not entirely sure of the technicalities of how that might work, but if they are considered school days and they're just not physically in the school, they're physically in your care, they may still be able to eat through school lunch and school breakfast. Don't have all the answers on how that would work, but that's really the main option for getting a meal, a breakfast and a lunch to the kids in your care. CACFP at risk would be an option, but only in eligible areas. So that's within the attendance zone of a school where half the students are eligible for free or reduced price meals. CACFP at risk never had area eligibility waivers like summer meals. So can pretty much guarantee that that's going to be the case into the coming school year, that it's only going to be in the traditionally eligible areas. And that's limited to one meal and one snack. At least with the waivers that exist on service time, I don't think it would be a problem to serve during the school day. Typically CACFP at risk after school has to be after school on school days. But with the meal service times waiver, I think you can make an argument that you can serve at any time under that waiver. And likewise with CACFP, you also have the congregate waiver, but without the enrichment waiver, I don't know how much that gets you. And another option I just want to highlight for people who are providing care for children of essential workers is CACFP outside school hours. It's limited to kids who are 12 and under, and you do have to do income eligibility forms and claim according to eligibility status, but that at least opens up breakfast, lunch, and snack. So if you have kids in your care all day because their parents are working 8+ hour shifts, this does give you the option to serve more meals than CACFP at risk does. So it might be a good thing to chat about with your state agency if this may help you to navigate that situation. And then for other nonprofit sponsors that are not providing in-person care, the options are, again, not great. As I said, no SFSP option at the current time. The only option is really CACFP at risk. And again, only in eligible areas, and there's still that enrichment requirement. So you can talk with your state agency about what you might be able to count as an enrichment activity in this new world. We know a lot of out-of-school time programs have been doing great things with virtual programming and staying in touch with the kids they normally serve. And we would hope that maybe those kinds of things could still count as fulfilling the enrichment activity requirement. Because again, we do at least have the congregate meal waiver for CACFP and those other waivers, it's just that activity. So if you could work with your state agency on a way to provide virtual activities or limited contact activities, you may be able to get around that and serve a meal and a snack through CACFP at risk. But we know that kind of interpretation of what counts as an enrichment activity varies state by state. So it's really critical to talk with your state agency and figure that out. I think that is it. If you want to move on to the next slide, I think I have that information summarized there. Yeah, so that is all that I have. Again, I know the options are not awesome, but we wanted to make sure you had this information and understood it as best as possible. And I will be on hand answering questions. And again, we'll get into more of these specifics in future webinars, but for now, I want to turn it over to my colleague, Jordan Bailey, to talk about financial relief, because we know everyone could need that too.
Thank you, Carolyn, and good afternoon, everyone. My name is Jordan Bailey, and I'm on our state advocacy team here at Share Our Strength. So I think we recognize that a lot of nutrition programs are facing financial strain due to the increased operational cost of providing emergency meals after schools closed and through the summer, and then at the same time experiencing decreased revenues. So we've been trying to figure out what funding streams, what opportunities are available for programs to tap into to make up for some of those lost funds. One potential option that we've identified is funding that's been provided through the CARES Act. The CARES Act was federal legislation that was passed back during kind of the beginning of the pandemic. Was really big. It provided $2.2 trillion to a lot of different programs. But I think we've kind of identified 3 potential funds that was under the CARES Act that could be opportunities for nutrition programs. So there's the Coronavirus Relief Fund, which was a large state and local aid fund that was provided through the Treasury to states. And those could broadly cover costs associated with basically any COVID-19 response efforts. And then there's 2 funds that was administered by the US Department of Education. And those funds are the Elementary and Secondary School Emergency Relief Fund, or ESSER fund. That money was provided to state education agencies. And then 90% of those funds, at least 90%, needed to be subgranted to school districts or LEAs based on Title I funding formulas. And those could broadly be used to cover a number of things related to school functionality, but the statute did also identify planning to provide school meals. And then lastly, there's the Governor's Emergency Education Relief Fund, or the GEAR Fund. And that money was provided from the US Department of Education to governors. They could use that fund to support institutions of higher education or LEAs, school districts, with issues related to school functionality during COVID. So I think those are kind of the 3 funds that we've identified, and luckily they're not just theoretical now. We actually have state examples of allocations specifically for school nutrition. So Virginia, for example, they recently allocated $3 million of the governor's fund, so the GEAR fund, to support school-based meal programs. North Carolina, the legislature there appropriated $75 million in state aid provided through the CARES Act to support school meals. And California recently appropriated $112.2 million as part of their annual state budget process from ESSER funds to support school meal programs. And next slide. And then we also have Kentucky as an example of, in Kentucky, the governor there made the GEAR funds available to school districts based on Title I funding. Instead of making a specific allocation for school nutrition, it did say, though, in the guidance that school nutrition was among the expenses that the GEAR funds could cover. So I think we're still trying to figure out exactly what the mechanics will be of the Kentucky scheme. But it was good to see that school nutrition was specifically called out in the guidance provided by the state as something that they wanted the funds to be able to cover. And the other example is Vermont, and they recently appropriated some of their state CARES Act funds to cover summer meals, so meals provided in June, July, and August, so to provide additional aid there. Don't know if we're having trouble with the slides.
I'm sorry, all. It has taken about 4 clicks each time to advance a slide. and the back function is not currently working. So unless anyone has a troubleshooting technique to offer me.
I can just continue.
I'm sorry, all I do know that is inconvenient.
So I think the strategy for sponsors for programs moving forward really kind of depends on whether you're in a state right now where CARES Act funds have been allocated. If that's the case, maybe reach out to your state agency, ask what the process is, the timeline. Some of these specific allocations for school nutrition are going to be additional reimbursements, while other programs are probably going to be more application-based grant programs based on the need associated from the school district. If you don't live, or your program is not operated in a state that's made a specific allocation for school nutrition, there's kind of several options I think that's available. First, I think most school districts are going to receive ESSER funds. So generally, if the school district receives Title I funding, there's a pretty high chance they're going to receive some kind of federal funds through the ESSER program. And so it may be worth having a conversation with your superintendent, with district leadership, about whether there's an opportunity to use those funds to support nutrition program. Unless the state agency has narrowed the scope of what those funds can be used for, the statute is certainly broad enough that those funds can be used to support nutrition. That might not be the initial instinct that leadership has, and I think for policymakers as well, that wasn't the first instinct, because there was a lot of discussion about, classroom cleaning, Wi-Fi, broadband connectivity for use of these funds. But that option is available, and California, having actually allocated these funds for school nutrition, kind of proves the case that that's an opportunity. We know a lot of other states that we're talking to are currently having conversations about requesting these funds. So the decisions being made by the governor's office, being made by appropriators in the legislature. So these conversations might be happening. So reach out to your state agency, see if there's plans in place to allocate some CARES Act funds for nutrition programs. And if there isn't, it's a good opportunity for advocacy, because there's clearly a need. There's clearly a need that you all can bring to policymakers. And now we have, again, several examples of states actually taking action on this front. One other area that also wanted to cover, in addition to CARES Act, is FEMA Public Assistance Grants. I'm going to keep this one quite short. FEMA Public Assistance is very complicated, but at a high level, FEMA Public Assistance Grants become available once a national emergency has been declared. So in this case, back when the national emergency was declared due to the pandemic, FEMA grants became available. These grants are available to qualifying entities, which is generally a governmental entity or a nonprofit, to cover qualifying work. And in response to the COVID pandemic, FEMA actually put out specific guidance that referenced food distribution, including serving meals, as potential qualifying work during COVID-19. There's a cost sharing requirement for FEMA grants. So generally the federal government will cover 75% of the cost, while the qualifying entity covers the remaining 25%. I think the probably largest barrier to being successful in getting FEMA grants is the prohibition on duplication of benefits. So essentially, FEMA grants can't cover cost related to providing assistance if that assistance is available through another federal program. So this can be kind of challenging for child nutrition program operators, but I think we understand that in many instances, nutrition programs became kind of community hubs during this pandemic, and we're serving high-risk populations, we're serving all sorts of people who may not be kind of the traditional clients of the program. So I think in those instances, that's probably the best argument where FEMA funds may be able to cover some of those costs. And lastly, just wanted to note some potential opportunities that may be coming down the pike. First, previously had mentioned that the CARES Act included the two education funds, the GEAR fund and the ESSER fund, that could be used for school meals. Luckily, those funds are proposed to be re-upped in both the Democratic and Republican proposals that are currently being negotiated in Congress. So if your state agency or the governor has already made decisions about how to spend these funds and school nutrition was not included, there may be a second bite at the apple in the future. Another area, of course, there's been a lot of news about the need for state and local aid through a next federal relief package. If that's to come about, very unclear at this moment whether or not state and local relief will actually make it in the package. But if it does, there may be decision making about how to actually spend that money and an opportunity for school nutrition to be included in some of that allocation. I think the best opportunity is related probably to the Feed the Children Act, which is federal legislation that would actually provide additional reimbursements to school nutrition programs associated with the emergency operation cost. So very simple, it's federal money specifically for nutrition, cuts off the middleman, don't need to have additional advocacy on the state level about spending state money specifically for school nutrition. And that bill was actually incorporated into the House passed HEROES Act. So we'll have to see through the negotiation process whether it's going to actually be included in the final bill. And lastly, I'm just through state-based aid on here. I think this is probably the most unlikely given the budget deficits that most states are facing, but something we're going to continue looking out for and we'll continue to watch for. And I think that's it for me. So I will turn it over to my colleague, Emily.
I'll just say thank you so much, Jordan, for being a champ as we navigate what sometimes feels like inevitable technological challenges. So thank you. And to our attendees, as I shared earlier, we will be sharing the full PowerPoint, the slide deck after the webinar. So I apologize that what Jordan was saying was not aligning with the slides, but you all will receive the full slide deck. So you'll see the points that he shared, as well as we will share links to additional resources that share more information about these specific programs. Emily?
Thanks so much, Kelly. And hello, everyone. My name is Emily, and I work on universal free school meals at our Center for Best Practices for No Kid Hungry. I know that this has been a ton of information that we're throwing at you. So yes, please don't feel like you have to take copious notes. You will get a copy of the slides, and we have these in resources. I also want to note quickly before I dive into the community eligibility provision that we are getting your questions. We see them in the Q&A box. Thank you for sending them. We do have time for dedicated Q&A at the end of this webinar. So even if we're not typing answers to your questions there, we will talk through them aloud, and we will get back to you if for some reason we can't answer all of the questions that are in the Q&A box currently. So keep sending your questions. We will get to them later or in the follow-up. So I am excited to talk about the Community Eligibility Provision with all of you today. It's also called CEP. CEP is a school meal funding option of the National School Lunch Act that enables eligible schools to provide free meals, free breakfast, and free lunch to all students, regardless of their individual income. And this year, we know that the challenges facing students, families, and schools are larger than they've ever been. Financially, we are all struggling, and CEP is a really great support to just help school budgets, specifically school nutrition budgets, recover this year. And in the next 4 years, we're going to talk about how CEP is a 4-year cycle and can generate revenue for your school nutrition budget. So we're going to talk about the financial impacts for your school. And also just grounding us in why we all do this work. CEP is an amazing opportunity for schools to provide a universal benefit to students and families at a time where they're really struggling and where unemployment is very high and household incomes are falling. CEP just takes one worry off of parents' plates, that they don't have to worry about whether or not their student qualifies for free school meals. It is a universal benefit in CEP schools, just like textbooks and desks. So on the next slide, we're going to dive in more to the basics of the Community Eligibility Provision. Again, I know that we're throwing a lot of information at you. If I'm talking too fast or if you need clarification on something that I've said, please go ahead and send it in the chat and I will see it and slow down or address your questions. So CEP, again, enables schools to provide free breakfast and lunch to all students at no cost to them. We know that school lunch shaming was in the press a lot in the last couple years, and CEP is often heralded as the antidote to school lunch shaming. Under CEP, you're not collecting student co-pays, you're not collecting any charges from parents or from students, and so you're eliminating unpaid school meal debt, and inherently, you do not have to worry about any negative press about school lunch shaming because no kid would be turned away for their inability to pay or for the debt that they've accumulated. And so students have equitable access to school meals, and that reduces the stigma for participating in school meals. We know specifically around school breakfast that there's often a perception that only students who cannot afford to eat breakfast at home participate in school breakfast, and we know that's not true. And CEP, again, changes the cultural norms in schools around school meals. And so it just becomes a normal part of the school day, like school lunch. It's available to everyone, no questions asked. And so that reduced stigma, combined with the increased access by eliminating cost barriers, also tends to increase participation in your school meals programs. And so CEP schools, depending on what their meal service models looked like in the past, can see really huge participation gains in breakfast and lunch. We've seen, if combined with breakfast after the bell, which we know is a best practice, if schools go breakfast after the bell, specifically breakfast in the classroom, and go CEP, and maybe before they were doing, when they were doing traditional counting and claiming, they had breakfast in the cafeteria before school, and so few students were participating. We've seen breakfast participation jump 400%, which is increased revenue, which is increased reimbursement, and taken together with the decreased administrative burden that we're going to talk about, you're not counting and claiming by individual student and by their individual fee category anymore. Although there are caveats and nuances this year and unique challenges, so we'll talk about some of those and answer your questions around counting and claiming procedures under CEP. But in normal school operations, you're counting the total number of meals served to students, not tracking individual student and their fee category. And so this reduced administrative burden and increased participation can really generate revenue for the school nutrition fund. And because CEP is a 4-year cycle, you can benefit tremendously over the course of the next 4 years by adopting CEP this year and having a universal free school meals program through school year 23-24. So who can operate CEP? An individual school or a group of schools must have an identified student percentage, or the ISP, of 40% or more to operate CEP. So on the next slide, we're going to get into the ISP and who can be included in the identified student percentage. The identified student percentage is the percent of identified students, and these students are categorically eligible for free school meals by their participation in another means tested program. So the total percentage of your student body that is categorically eligible for free school meals. You take your number of identified students divided by your total student enrollment, multiply it by 100, that is your ISP. So who can be included in the ISP? Students can be included as identified in the ISP if they or a household member participates in SNAP, the Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program, and TANF, which is cash-based temporary assistance for needy families, in FDIPR, the Food Distribution Program on Indian reservations, and in 19 states where there's that Medicaid direct certification pilot, Medicaid students who are certified as Medicaid free would also be included in the ISP. So in these first four bullet points here, I say students can be identified by their participation or by a household member's participation, because just breaking it down with a really simple example, if I am in school, I'm a student, and I am on SNAP, and I'm showing up on my school's direct certification list, and I have say I have a cousin who is living with me at my address, and in our student record system, you can see that we share an address, but my cousin isn't showing up on the SNAP list. The school nutrition director is able to extend eligibility to my cousin and include us both in the ISP. So in these first couple categories here listed on the slide, you can include students who are on the direct certification list and any other students or siblings who are located at that same address. You can extend the eligibility to. Children can also be included in the ISP if they are in foster care, experiencing homelessness, in Head Start or Early Head Start, and or who are migrant. However, these last four bullet points on the slide, their eligibility does not extend to other siblings in the household. So by the same example, I'm in school, I have a younger sibling in Head Start. They would be included in the ISP, but I could not. So the identified student percentage, well, just direct certification in general, regardless of whether you're doing CEP, is really critical, because regardless of whether you're doing CEP, it enables you to give free school meals to those students who are captured in direct certification. And so especially, I know this year, schools are worrying about getting their free and reduced price meals applications back if they're not operating CEP. Direct certification is a really critical support to make sure that kids who are categorically eligible and participating in these other programs are being captured, identified, and given that free school meal benefit regardless of CEP status. Last thing I'll say on this slide is that the categories in, again, those bottom four are, some states include them in their direct certification systems, but often you have to go to your district's homeless liaison, your local migrant ed coordinator, your Head Start director to get those lists of students. So it's really critical that you are reaching out and in direct conversation with the folks in your district, in your locale, that are capturing and identifying these students and sharing them with school nutrition. And on the next slide, you'll see that the ISP is more than just, determines more than just eligibility for CEP. Again, you have to have an ISP of 40% to operate CEP, but the ISP also determines your reimbursement rate under CEP. So under CEP, there is no reduced price category. We only have free and paid. To calculate your free reimbursement rate under CEP, you take your identified student percentage and multiply it by 1.6. So by example, say that I am working at a school with an ISP of 55% times 1.6, 88% of the breakfast and lunches that I serve will be reimbursed at the free rate. And then the remainder, so 100 minus my free reimbursement rate, 12% will be reimbursed at the federal paid rate. The magic ISP that everyone is seeking is 62.5%, because that is the ISP at which all of the meals, because 62.5 times 1.6 is 100, at which all of the meals that you serve are reimbursed at the free rate, but it is not the ISP at which CEP becomes financially viable. That is an individual question for school districts, what ISP will work for them and pay off financially. If this is something that you need help with, there are tools available to kind of forecast what a good ISP might look like for your district and how you might expect to increase participation if you adopt CEP, and how does that offset maybe the percentage of the meals that you're serving at the paid rate. So at the end of this presentation, you'll see my email address and we can talk through individual district level concerns if you would like. Myself and some of our support staff can help with financial analyses for your district to figure out whether or not you can make CEP work for you at any ISP. So on the next slide, we just know generally that SNAP enrollment is increasing due to COVID-19. In the first couple months of the pandemic, SNAP enrollment increased 17% nationwide. And so we've seen that reflecting in many schools' ISPs across the country. So it's really critical, take a look at your ISPs. USDA extended a waiver around CEP election deadlines and certification deadlines. So this year, for most states, always important to double check with your state agency, you can use direct certification data from April 1st through June 30th to calculate your ISP. And also you can be extending eligibility and the best practices that we shared in the beginning of the slide to boost your ISP from that April 1st through June 30th. So you can use that data to establish your CEP eligibility and establish your ISPs for an election deadline of August 31st in most states this year. Some have set some earlier deadlines. And best practice is to be conducting direct certification often, even though you can only use data up through June 30th this year to establish your eligibility and establish your ISPs. If you continue to increase your ISPs by identifying more students through July, August, September into the next school year, if your ISPs increase, come next spring, you can start a new 4-year CEP cycle at a higher ISP and extend that universal free meal benefit another 4 years. So this is a great opportunity to lock in a high or higher ISP for this year and for the following 3 years, but important to keep looking at your direct sort numbers because trends are saying that we're probably going to see SNAP enrollment continue to increase throughout this year. So next slide, just some benefits here. We've talked a lot about these, so I'll move through them pretty quickly. But CEP can help with counting and claiming this year with more complex school meals operations. You have to have your plans approved by your state agency, and they will work with you on approving your counting and claiming operations plans. Under a typical school year, we see a lot of school nutrition directors opt to do tallies or use clickers to count students who are moving through the line to just get a total meals count. Saves paperwork, it speeds up lunch lines, contributes to efficiency. So that might be an option once we get back to normal school year. This year, we are hearing a lot of districts who are CEP having to still count and claim by individual students because of some more complex hybrid meal service operations, just to guarantee that you're only serving one meal per child. So the general rule is the more controlled your meal service environment, the more likely it is that your state agency would approve a plan that just allows for total counting and claiming of total meals served. But if you cannot safeguard against serving more than one meal per child at that given meal service time, your state agency this year may require you to still do counting and claiming by fee category and individual student. It is easier if you are doing meals in the classroom to do CEP. You don't have to worry about training teachers on which students are free versus reduced price versus paid and making sure they're counting accordingly. Again, total meal counts work if you're doing lunch in the classroom by and large. On the next slide, we have a couple more benefits here. Again, decreasing financial stress among students and families cannot be overstated. Eliminating unpaid school meal debt cannot be overstated. I know this has been a large selling point for a lot of school districts this year. If unpaid school meal debt has been a challenge in the past, you cannot use federal funding to cover unpaid school meal debt at the end of the year. So typically, school districts use their general fund to cover unpaid school meal charges that they can't collect from families. And if there's ever a year we don't want the general fund education dollars going to cover unpaid school meal debt, it's this one. So this is a huge selling point. Again, removes so much stress from families and from school nutrition staff who don't have to worry about calling and collecting payments from families and not having to have the general fund cover those costs that they can't collect. And again, meal service for the next 4 years will be easier. If PEBT is reauthorized, CEP schools have an easier job of distributing funds. That has not yet been passed. We, as has been alluded earlier in the presentation, stimulus package is a question mark. So we'll see on PEBT, but if extended, CEP schools definitely have an easier time in distributing those funds to families. And quickly, I'd like to show a new tool for grouping. Grouping is an often underutilized component of CEP. It can maximize your federal reimbursement though. And so we know school nutrition budgets are struggling by and large, and grouping, if you're doing CEP, is a really great strategy to make sure that you're not leaving dollars on the table. And there's this new tool called Meals Count, which has lots of sophisticated algorithms behind it to run through multiple grouping scenarios, thousands of them in just a couple seconds, to determine what is your optimal grouping scenario for maximizing expected annual reimbursement. And so you'll see in this little diagram on the slide, grouping is a strategy to maximize reimbursement. You can see on the left, we have schools that are at 40% ISP and schools that are at 85% ISP. If you group them together into a group that has a claiming ISP of 40%, that's going to be, you're serving 36% of the meals that you serve would be reimbursed at the paid rate, whereas in that other group, you're getting all of the meals reimbursed at the free rate. If you just flip it and combine an 85 and a 40 with an 85 and a 40, both groups are at 62.5%. All schools are claiming at the free rate. So this is a very simple just demonstration of the power of grouping to really maximize your federal reimbursement. And on the next slide, I'm going to show you a quick preview of Meals Count and how it works. Again, you enter in your school data, your number of identified students, total enrollment, breakfast ADP and lunch ADP per school, and you input your federal reimbursement rates for breakfast and lunch at the free and paid category, and you press submit, and it takes a couple minutes depending on the size of your district, but the tool runs through, again, thousands of grouping scenarios and gives you an ideal scenario. And so this was a real example where in Oceanside, California, they used Meals Count and were able to increase their expected annual reimbursement just by shuffling schools around in their groups 13%. So it's really a useful tool. If you need any help with this, feel free to reach out to me. I think on the next slide is my contact information. And well, after some more resources here, but we have done, you'll see even on there, I have a video explaining how to use the tool and a link to the optimizer. I would be more than happy to help you with it and help you interpret results or troubleshoot. If you're doing CEP currently, it's a really great idea to revisit your grouping scenarios. And so just reminder that the deadline nationally is August 31st to declare your intent to elect CEP. And we're here to support with any questions or help that you may need in making that decision. And thank you all so much for joining.
Awesome, thank you. A huge thank you to my teammates. And I know, Jordan, you have to jump off, but Emily and Carolyn will be staying to help navigate the remainder of the question and answers. So please continue adding your questions there. And we will address those in a moment. And again, if there's anything that we can't get to for any reason today, we will look into those and do our best to provide answers in any webinar follow-up. But to just share some more resources with you, there are a number of resources that we've mentioned so far throughout this webinar that are hyperlinked within this slide deck. But to give you just some more examples of what we have available, we have a meal service options for school year 2021 resource. This really summarizes a lot of the great that Carolyn shared with you earlier in the webinar. We also have 2 equipment resources. We know as you all take on alternative meal service and look at innovative ways to connect your students with food, you're likely going to need some new or adapted equipment. So these resources highlight some either new things that you might need to purchase, but also provide a number of tips as to how you can adapt equipment that you already have. Because we know now more than ever, it's really important to keep those costs as low as possible. And there's also a summary of the current waivers that have been issued by the USDA. So these are nationwide waivers. I want to note that particularly for this resource, but really all of the resources that we've been creating around COVID response and back to school, our team regularly updates these resources. So you'll notice that many of them are dated. So just take a look at that if you're ever accessing the resources, but typically if there are announcements made by USDA, our team very quickly updates those. All of the resources that we've mentioned can be found at the link that's on the bottom of this screen. So we've set up a back to school page on our website. So you can go there, a one-stop shop for the resources we've created so far and the resources that are currently in the works and the resources that we'll work on after those ones. So one more thing, as we've mentioned today, we hope that we've been able to answer a lot of your questions, but we know that there are many, many more. If you still have questions, you are definitely not the only one. So if you are interested in additional support, there are a number of ways to connect with our team. You can email us. Our email address is here. I also encourage you to subscribe to our newsletter if you haven't already. So particularly if you found out about this webinar through a channel that wasn't our newsletter and you don't receive it, I definitely encourage you to click that subscribe link. That will make sure that you get our newsletter, which right now comes out twice a month. You will get our newest resources as they come out hot off the press. You will get information about the back to school webinars that we will be doing after this one. And you can also visit the webinar section of our website. So if you ever miss a webinar or you want to go back and just see what we've covered in the past, you can always find the slide decks and recordings there. So we encourage you to reach out if we can be of any more help to you. And of course, we can't reiterate enough that we recommend that you reach out to your state agency. Please keep them informed about your needs and challenges. We know that they're all working very diligently on your behalf to make sure that you have the flexibility that you need to keep kids fed as the situation continues. So with that, I'm going to officially open it up for Q&A. I know that our team has been answering some questions in writing, and I see, Carolyn, that you flagged some for in-person response. So I'm going to toss it over to you if you would like to speak to some of those questions that you flagged.
Yes, great. I've been doing my best to answer questions in writing though. So if you have asked a question, I encourage you to look at the Q&A box. Hopefully I answered it. If I didn't, feel free to type in clarification or a follow-up. But for the ones that I marked to address live, Annalisa asked if I could speak to the impact of SFSP waivers expiring. It's going to be bad. It's going to be terrible. I don't have a quantified response for that one, but we know that for schools, it's going to be a challenge to operate the school meals programs because of all of the counting and claiming rules. So for schools to lose the option to operate summer meals is going to be hard. We've heard anecdotally of schools saying that maybe they just won't serve meals at all because their staff are burnt out, or they just don't know how to navigate all of these things. It would take too much money to get new, touchless scanners and work out all of these other things. We've heard schools that say they don't know how they can serve remote learners at the same time as their in-person students because of all of these, different things to navigate. And then again, especially for nonprofit sponsors who have been so critical in helping to meet the huge need right now and, filling the gap that schools haven't always been able to fill, whether because the need is so huge, communities are, very spread out, or schools that have had staff members test positive and have to stop operations. We know nonprofits have been critical, but without the after school enrichment waiver too, there are really very few options for nonprofit sponsors to step in and help meet the need right now. So yeah, I know that doesn't necessarily help anyone at this moment, but I feel so strongly about this. So thank you for raising that because we know it's a big issue, and that's why we are doing what we can both on the Hill and with USDA to encourage them to extend more waiver options to help meet the need in the coming year. So that was one of the questions. The next one I think brings up a really important caveat that I did not make at all, which is about child care licensing rules. So for organizations that may be providing care for children of essential workers, when that's not something they've typically done, they haven't typically provided full day care in the past, there may be state licensing regulations. It is such a patchwork though, so I cannot even begin to tell you whether or not you may be affected by this or be working with sites that would be affected by this. As the example in the question discusses, it's, in that area, it relies on whether you're caring for children or for more or less than 4 hours a day. So in a lot of states with those kinds of rules, typical after school programs may be exempt from licensing because they only provide care for 2 to 3 hours. But if you're entering a situation where you're doing all day care, you may need a child care license. So definitely check in with your state agency. Hopefully they can point you to whoever the licensing authority is in your state to tell you what may apply to you. So that is a really important caveat. And that also applies if you're trying to participate under CACFP outside school hours care, that oftentimes there's a licensing component that goes along with that too. So it's a big added hurdle that's kind of like required in order to operate these programs, but not part of these programs per se. It's basically just USDA saying that if there's a state or local requirement for licensure, you have to meet it. So thank you for raising that question, Kara. And let's see. Emily, I'll turn it over to you to address the CEP question.
Okay. So a question came in that more or less said, during a regular school year, students from non-CEP schools who are visiting a CEP school during mealtime can eat free, and still those meals count for federal reimbursement. Yes, that is correct for kids who are visiting a CEP school just temporarily, whether maybe it's some kind of special program or field trip, you can extend that benefit. However, that logic does not extend to this year by and large. The question goes on to ask if students from non-CEP schools within a district pick up meals at CEP schools within that same district, can those meals be served for free to students even if they're not enrolled in that CEP school? No. State agencies would probably require that you do individual. If your district is doing partial CEP and can't prevent against students who are enrolled in non-CEP schools from picking up meals in CEP schools, your district would require that you count and claim by individual student. So you could not serve free meals to students in non-CEP schools, even if they're picking up at a CEP site. I know that it's confusing and this isn't a normal scenario or something we would experience in any other school year, but unless you can find a way to bring those non-CEP schools on, you have to do counting and claiming by fee category. If I didn't quite answer that, or if it didn't make sense, feel free to follow up with me. But unfortunately, we can't just give free meals to students just because they show up at CEP schools.
Thank you, Emily. I'm glad I'm not the only person that does not have answers for everything today. I did have another question about whether a school could serve a breakfast for Monday on Friday. I think that would be possible under the current waivers if, as was indicated, there is school on Monday. Because of the congregate waiver and the meal service time waiver, I think it would be doable to send breakfast for Monday home on Friday, assuming you don't plan to serve breakfast again on Monday. So if that works best for the school, I think it is doable, but as always, as with everything, as I say ad nauseum, please check with your state agency. We do not have the authority to tell you what is ultimately doable. And we know that there are always extenuating circumstances that may affect whether or not something is possible or not. So it's worth asking. I think it might be possible, but in the end, your state agency can work with you to figure out what system would work best.
I think that has brought us to having answered all of the questions that we've received for now. Carolyn or Emily, is there any final thought that you would like to offer before we wrap up? Completely optional.
Hopefully we'll be able to follow up with some of the Q&A that we did in writing. There were some really great questions in there and some things that I probably could have done a better job clarifying about what waivers are available now and what they mean, because we know there's an acronym soup happening. And if you do have follow-up questions, please don't hesitate to reach out afterward.
I'll add one quick thing that has come up in the chat more as a state-specific example, but it is worth bringing up because it is a question that comes a lot is around education funding, specifically state education funding and CEP. How do those things interact? There is a great resource from FRAC that has a chart of each state and what their policies are for administering state education funding to CEP schools. About 30 states require that CEP schools use alternative income forms. So it's basically the free and reduced price meals application, just scrubbing any information about it being tied to school meals benefits. They require that you administer those alternative income forms so that you can still collect that proxy free and reduced priced meals data and administer state education funding accordingly. Some states just use your ISP times 1.6 as that free and reduced price proxy and don't require that you administer alternative income forms. Some require that you administer alternative income forms every 4 years. So it is a mixed bag really on how state education funding works with CEP. But if your state does not require that you administer alternative income forms, you forgo all free and reduced price meals applications or any income information paperwork for your district. You're not required to do that. So that is an administrative saving. That is an administrative savings that is available to many CEP schools, is not having to collect free and reduced price meals applications and process those anymore. And I believe my colleague's going to send the FRAC resource that I mentioned in the chat here, but it's also in the slides. So again, yes, please reach out if you have any questions. Thank you all for your great questions, and here to help however.
Well, thank you so much to my teammates. Thank you, Emily. Thank you, Carolyn. Thank you, Chelsea, behind the scenes. Our slides might not have transitioned smoothly the whole time, but we are very timely. We're right at the end mark. So just reiterating what you've heard a number of times today, please reach out to us if you have additional questions. We will be sharing via a follow-up email the slide deck, the recording, a number of the resources that are linked within the slide deck. We can also pull those out for convenience, and our team will also look at sharing with you all some of the questions and answers that we addressed today. Be on the lookout for information coming hopefully very soon about additional webinars in this back to school series. And just a big thank you for joining us all today. A little bit cliche to say, but we are very, very much in this together. You know, we are trying to get as many answers as possible and are hoping for as much flexibility. But we are here to help you as best we can. Again, thank you for joining us, and hopefully we will see you in the webinar world soon.